Cool. Thanks, Liz. Good morning, everybody, and thanks for joining me today. Today, we're going to talk about hybrid cloud strategies and management. So, as part of the intro, we're going to look at the four main pillars of this topic of discussion, and hopefully it gives you guys something to take back and really think about as we start this journey to the cloud, or even some of us who are well down that road, right? And so, the biggest objective today that I want to bring out of this is for you to answer this one question as we're going through this presentation, and it's that how can my organization begin using the hybrid cloud today, right? And there's some I guess there's some inconsistency with the way people consider what hybrid cloud means to them. There's a misconception that connectivity between a VPN and your data center and your on-premises environment, or your data center and a public cloud would be hybrid. And the way that Microsoft really defines this is that you're going beyond just having that connectivity, and it really comes down to a consistency of that experience. And as we dive in and talk about those four pillars, you'll see what I mean when we talk about consistency. So, hybrid cloud really presents some great opportunities, right? The initial idea of hybrid was rejected. There were some people who came out and said, we have to stay all on-prem, and we listed a few of those reasons, right? Data sovereignty, regulatory, the physical nature of the CEO liking to have the servers there on display or locked in a closet on the grounds of the business, right? And some of these things are somewhat valid, and some of them, need to stay intact. And that's why, 80% of enterprises see themselves operating hybrid clouds for the foreseeable future. And you can see that this is increasing, is that the number of enterprises that have a hybrid cloud strategy, excuse me, and 87% of organizations are planning to integrate their on-premises data centers with the public cloud. And so when we talk about the hybrid, right, it's really having this consistency across the four main areas, which is a common identity, management, security, data platform, and a unified development space. Now, that unified development space is kind of a niche space, right? Not everybody's doing their own development, but when we talk about some of the services around Azure Stack and the continuity between Stack and Azure services, if you're doing any development in-house, this is a great option to have a hybrid environment. So jumping in, when we talk about the identity management, right? Hybrid identity with Windows Server, Active Directory, and Azure Active Directory, really we've got the reality today of a mobile first, cloud first situation, right? So 63% of data breaches involved weak, stolen, or default passwords. More than 80% of employees admit that they've installed Dropbox or a Salesforce instance or something like that without the authorization of IT. We're trying to manage all of this stuff, but at the same time, our budgets are barely growing, if at all, right? And when we look at the current reality, you've got all of these great services that are being spun up, many businesses that we come across are running things like Salesforce and Dropbox and Microsoft Azure and Dynamics and Office 365. You've got a whole slew of devices to manage. You've got tablets, you've got phones, you've got laptops, plus you've got all of your on-premises management, your devices that you're managing in-house, and the ad hoc ones that you don't have the ability to manage, and your Active Directory with Windows Server, right? So there is all of this landscape that needs to be navigated, and when we think about it, identity is really the new identity, the new control plane, right? So you can integrate thousands of apps with one identity. You can enable business without borders. You can manage access at scale, and it gives you that cloud-powered protection, right? Azure Active Directory at the core of your business really enables you to have a single sign-on experience across the lines, integrating with your in-house applications, the software as a service-based applications, and many more, really. it's important to realize that we've moved past the firewall. A firewall is not protecting your users that are in the cloud, that are out in the mobile workforce, that are in an airport, you know, and really brute forcing a firewall is very passé. Instead, they're going to do a spear phishing attempt with info from your website about who your CFO is or who your CEO is, and ordering them to send a payment to somebody or authorize something, right? So these are the threats that we have to worry about. And with the ability to manage identity in one area, it gives us a much better control plane. Looking at a high level, right, identity is the core of the enterprise mobility. Azure Active Directory is that control plane. So you have your on-premises directory, right? And you've got your cloud SaaS applications, custom applications, public cloud, you know, all of the connections in there. At the center of this is Microsoft Azure Active Directory, where you simply link your connection with your on-premises Active Directory. Then you hook in your Azure Active Directory with your all of your cloud offerings, so your SaaS apps and your Azure and Office 365. This then allows your users to have their own self-service. They can create their own single sign-on. So if they lose their password, they're not calling the IT help desk to say, hey, reset my password. They've got self-service capability there using, you know, two-factor authentication, sending a text message to your phone or sending an email. And then you've got the single sign-on experience with all of these applications, which really allows you to have one password for all of your applications. It really simplifies the management. All of this then synchronizes back to your Active Directory, and it can be extended out to your customers and your partners as well. So when we think about it, you've got single sign-on to any application, starting with Microsoft Azure, right? Synchronizing your Windows Server Active Directory and your Azure Active Directory and other directories, right? You can use other directories to synchronize with your Azure Active Directory. You can extend that out to your SaaS applications, your web applications, so using the Azure Active Directory application proxy, other custom integrated apps as well, right? So this gives you that, again, that single sign-on experience, thousands of apps, one identity. Now, when we talk about Azure Active Directory domain services, so by simply connecting your Windows Server Active Directory to your Azure Active Directory, it also opens up the capability to much more easily lift and shift any of your environment capabilities. So if you want to move your Azure, your virtual machines or your databases up into the cloud, you can use still the same authentication scheme, okay? So better security starts at the OS. When you can protect identity, protect the OS on premises and in the cloud, and help secure virtual machines, it gives you a great amount of power, right? So we all know what happened at Equifax last year. These are happening all the time. And every time they re-release information, there are more people that have been affected that they initially had estimated low on, right? So nobody wants to be the person responsible for this, right? So when you look at Windows Server 2016, Microsoft said, you know, we want to do this better. We want to deploy the server that helps you make your environment more secure. And by simply upgrading, migrating your existing servers to the 2016 and now the newly announced 2019 platforms, you've already made your environment more secure. Just some quick examples here. I mean, there's obviously a lot more that's been introduced, but things like shielded VMs that, you know, are essentially a virtual black box, if you will. It's the VHD and the VHDX files are encrypted and cannot be opened without the encryption keys. This supports Windows, and it's only available in Hyper-V. And the competitors don't yet have this service. Also, you know, things like enhanced threat detection built in, Windows Defender built in, and some of these other services, right? Enable security at cloud speed. So with Windows Server 2016, 2019, Azure, your platform is being continuously assessed from a security standpoint. So it's looking at all of your workloads, right? It's creating policy-driven recommendations, and it'll help to guide the users through the process of remediating security vulnerabilities. So what does this mean? Microsoft in the background is running machine learning algorithms to see what those workloads look like, what those attack vectors are, and closing the holes, changing the systems to rapidly adapt to any of those security issues, okay? Now, one of the questions you have to ask yourself is, do I want to take Microsoft's approach, a company that spends over $1 billion a year on security alone? They spend more than any other company in the world on security yearly to make sure that your platform is secure. Now, granted, it's the most attacked surface as well, so they have to make that investment. But with that sizable investment and having those machine learning algorithms and the AI components that help to secure things better, I would challenge you to say that your infrastructure is going to be more secure. One of the other features was the just-in-time RDP and SSH access to virtual machines. Basic example of this is, upon user request for RDP access to a server, we're going to deploy the privileges for 3 hours using role-based access control security, and it's going to auto-privilege. And then after that 3 hours is up, it'll deprivilege that user. This will help you not have to turn off that user's access. It allows you to renew it if needed. It allows you to change the time if needed. But really, you shouldn't need to stay logged in as an admin to your servers, right? So revoking that access is just going to help, again, harden your security. This is for RDP and SSH. Another example is, prioritize recommendations, right? So here's a quick list of all the workloads running on a server. How many people in the audience are able to, quickly look at this list without having a third-party tool that took weeks or months to install and, takes a whole bunch of time to migrate and make sure that, patches are up to date and all that, Microsoft now has it baked into the OS, and it really helps you secure the workloads with a simple on-off switch. So in this example, we're talking about enabling transparent data encryption for a SQL database. Simply click on it. It gives you the ability to hit data encryption on or off right there, and you can turn it on, right? So as the marketplace grows, you can see that there are some, high priority workloads in there already, Barracuda and Cisco and Checkpoint. There are many, many more if you go check out the Azure Marketplace. But this is growing, right? And it's going to help recommend and streamline provisioning. We love the tools that we're already running, and Azure wants to provide you the ability to continue to use those, oftentimes by being able to use the same licensing that you already have. And that's a partner-specific thing, so you'd have to check with them specifically. But it does leverage the Azure Marketplace for commerce and billing, so you're being billed right through that same billing that you're already receiving for your Azure environment. What it does, it allows you to deploy security solutions from the partners that are already in the marketplace, right? So let's just say you want to add a web application firewall, who do you want it from, right? So you've got some options here. You want to create a new one. You want to specify Barracuda or F5. There are obviously more in there now, and I want to select my deployment model. I'm going to create the firewall, and now I can spin it up and I can leverage the technology used by F5 to synchronize with my on-premises environment, okay? You can also do this with managed partner security solutions, right? So there's just a couple of examples, and anything for your management of your environment, right? So the next pillar is really, when you think about it, how the world is changing, right? We've got Huge data requirements. So data is estimated to grow to 44 zettabytes in 2020. 80% of organizations today now adopt a cloud-first strategy, and the AI investment is increasing by 300% in 2017, and that's just going to grow and grow. So really, you've got these three common areas: data, AI, and cloud, and it's proven that organizations that harness data, cloud, and AI outperform the competition, right? So nearly double of the operating margin and 100 million in additional operating income. And this was done by third-party reporting and surveys. And this is not Microsoft saying, claiming these things. And these companies, when you look at the way that Jet has grown and closed the gap between them and Walmart, and Amazon. DocuSign is a totally digital company, and who would have thought 5 years ago that you could run a company totally in the cloud and everything being a digital asset, no longer needing paper. And then when you think about Honeywell and the adventure they went down and setting up these smart thermometers and thermostats, they've got some strong competition in the space, but by employing AI technologies and giving that smart capability to be able to manage your thermostat from the home with more and more features coming out and more technologies, these companies are great cornerstone examples of how the cloud and data platform can help you out innovate. They also rely on a modern data estate, right? So when you think about transforming your business, you've got shopping data, you've got social data, graph data, images, big data, Twitter, automated cars. There's this divide between what's being handled on-prem and what's being handled in the cloud. And really the idea here is that you can extend your on-prem environment right to the cloud with these common technologies, right? So you can reason over any data anywhere. You've got the flexibility of choice, and you've got the security and performance employing those ML and AI technologies we discussed earlier. So with SQL Server 2017, now you've got the choice of language and platform, right? So you can deploy it to Linux, Windows, obviously, and Docker containers. You've got industry-leading performance, number one in OLTP performance, or number one in data warehouse performance, and number one in price performance. It's been the most secure enterprise database over the last 7 years. It's the only commercial database with AI features built in, R and Python, right? There are other smaller sector database systems that do have those built in. This is the only commercial database that has it. And you've got end-to-end mobility on any device, really, at a fraction of the cost of the competitors. And when you look at the cost of a Microsoft SQL Server versus that of Oracle, it's about 1/10 of the cost. And what it allows you to do is it allows you to extend your private data center, your private cloud, your on-premises environment to the public cloud. Uses the same technology as Azure DB in the cloud with SQL 2017, uses the same code base, and the feature set is almost identical. So continuing that cloud-first approach, right, it really helps you breed faster innovation, right? So it's continuously being enhanced. We're using these ML and AI methodologies in order to embrace any kind of new technology. We're constantly updating the code set, both in Azure and on-prem, right? And now as we start this journey down the path of the cloud, we've got some really seamless and reliable migration strategies here, right? So you can lift and shift your existing environment with no code changes, right? So if you're running SQL on-prem, you can lift and shift that database up into the cloud with little to no effort. Obviously there's a migration and moving the data, but Microsoft is giving us the tools to do it in a much more streamlined way. And you can maximize your current on-premises licensing investments, right? So you've got the Azure hybrid benefit, where if you already have enterprise edition of SQL Server with software assurance, you can leverage some of that licensing up in Azure. Right, so it's really just making an easier path to get to the cloud with your data investment. When we look at Azure SQL Database, right, it's got learning and adapting. It scales on the fly, so you can go from a standard node. You know, if you need more storage space or you need more compute, you can bring those up and down in somewhat of an automated fashion. You've got multi-tenant for a SaaS application. It works in your environment, right? So the development tools are everything that you're very comfortable and familiar with already. You don't have to get a whole new set of tools in order to use the Azure SQL database, and it secures and protects. It's all automatically got built-in security features as required. And when you look at things like the Azure machine learning, right, and using Azure SQL database, it really leads to these intelligent, responsive apps. So it's allowing us to have a scalable, flexible platform that helps us to grow around the cloud ecosystems. So Microsoft is fully committed to the cloud, right? So as I mentioned earlier, they spend over $1 billion a year on cloud security, and they, you know, have really made this commitment. When you compare what Microsoft Azure has done compared to AWS, say, you know, there are over 70 regulatory compliances that they fulfill, you know, so ISO and HIPAA and Sarbanes-Oxley and you know, a lot of the GDPR, you know, a lot of those sort of security and regulatory buzzwords are all satisfied by Microsoft Azure, right? They you know, have the ability for database of choice, right? So again, Microsoft's commitment to open source and giving people what they want to be able to use, you know, as a native PaaS offering, you know, MySQL and PostgreSQL were recently announced as you know, capabilities for GA, right? So you can create a built-in high availability, right? It sets up in minutes because you're using a PaaS offering. You know, when you think about the parallels and how long it takes to go and request a server from IT, you know, get that server in place, build out the server, make sure you encapsulate it for your security requirements, and go through that whole process. I mean, that can take weeks and months, whereas you can spin up this environment in a matter of minutes and, you know, have the capability at your fingertips. When we start, you know, extending that that platform to big data and advanced analytics, Microsoft has a, you know, a whole bunch of offerings around this. This slide's actually a little old. We need to include in here. I lost it. Anyway, you know, so you can prep and chain the data. Starting with the ingestion using Data Factory, you can store the data in Data Lake and storage blobs. You can train the data using Hadoop and HD Insight. And then you can model that data out and serve it up to the users in a geolocated area for really speedy performance, right? So, you know, hosting your data in Azure Analysis Services. There are, you know, videos out there where you can see, you know, billions of records being hosted in Azure Analysis Services, and you know, Power BI demonstrations that show the data just as snappy as if it were far fewer records, or you know, all being right there on-prem in the same system. So the commitment to this whole landscape is definitely there on Microsoft's part. And really what we want to look at is the whole slate of that modern data estate, right? So we looked at this slide earlier, and really what we're capturing is all the areas of this, right? And when we talk about hybrid, it gives us that easy lift and shift capability with no code changes. You still got your on-prem workloads, you've got your in the cloud workloads, which with the AI built in, it is the most secure commercial database, and it has the lowest total cost of ownership. So by extending out this this data platform to the hybrid model, you can really take advantage of some of the newest technology and at a really competitive price, you know. So moving along, we can talk about Azure File Sync some. Now, one of the biggest challenges being in IT is dealing with those pesky file servers, right? You know, nobody really likes them. They're kind of a necessary evil, right? And so Microsoft really wanted to make this a better experience, right? So when you think about what the common pains are with a Windows file server is that you never seem to have enough storage. You never seem to get people to clean up all of their folders and files, and it's kind of messy, right? And they never seem to have access where they need it, right? So this has definitely improved over the last few years, but it really requires third-party tools, you know, third-party authentication types. You know, it doesn't seem like there's just a really good fit, you know, and so Microsoft built Azure File Sync. And as an example, right, so we set up a server in the Seattle headquarters, and you know, you've got your normal folder structure, right? And you get an alert that you're starting to run out of storage. Very, very common for people, right? So what you can do is you can build a file share using file sync, right? That allows you to set up the cloud tiering, right? So basically you set on your server and say, I want to keep 50% of this server full at all times. And so I don't want to go over 50% of capacity of my disk space. So when you make that setting, it's going to then gray out these folders. So note, the structure is still there. However, the files have now been offloaded to the cloud. What this does is it allows you to bring up a second site and synchronize those files with the same file share in Azure. It also allows you to extend that out to the local network for SMB and NFS shares to users and applications, as well as extending it out to work folders for mobile devices, right, and mobile workforce. Now, from there, you're getting the ability to have direct cloud access with your IaaS and PaaS solutions through an SMB and REST API. And let's just say that we lose this file server, right, at the headquarters office. Now they're already synchronized up to the cloud. We pull that server out of line, bring in the new server, synchronize it back with that Azure File Sync share. As you turn it on, those files will be grayed out to start, and then it'll begin populating as you move along. And on top of that, it's got an integrated cloud backup where you can back up your files to the Azure Backup Vault. So it really gives you a total solution, right? That when you think about those sort of nuances and those pains around the file service, it gives you the central file services and Azure storage, right? You can cache multiple locations for fast local performance. So if you've got a European office and a US headquarters and you want those files to be accessed at all locations, it's going to sync across to the multiple locations. And it uses that cloud-based backup and fast ER because we do run into situations where a file gets overwritten or deleted accidentally or moved to a different place, and this gives us a quick way to do it. So there's just a quick link that you can check out, aka.ms/AFS. Now, let's talk about site recovery, right? So Azure Site Recovery, let's talk about DR a little bit. Everybody remembers last year Hurricane Harvey and the challenges that we all faced, you know, whether we were affected by the hurricanes in those areas, or if one of our business units was down there, or, you know, customers, vendors. So this isn't something that was, you know, that just hit that area, really, you know. And when we think about it, really, there are a lot of causes of IT disasters, right? We think about the natural disasters, the hurricanes, floods, the storms, right? But we forget to kind of consider sometimes or things along the lines of power failures and hardware failures, network failures, right? And then moreover, human error, right? So you've got malicious errors and just somebody putting the wrong line of code that takes down the East Coast for 4 hours, right? These things happen. They happen all the time, and we know about them, right? So categorize these into 3 different areas: operational failures, natural disasters, and human caused events. But they really are all areas that we have to worry about. So any one of those areas would have a significant impact on the business, right? So, impact of the outage itself, right? So the flights were grounded because the computer systems were down. What happens to your brand when an event like this happens, right? So what happens to the stock price of your company when you have to report that there was a failure of some sort? And also, what happens to you? How does it impact your career, right? What is the impact when you are at the helm and there is a data loss or a data breach, or those types of things? So IT challenges when you're implementing business continuity are common across all companies, right? You've got the cost, you've got the complexity, and you've got the coverage and compliance, right? So buying hardware, bringing up a data center, the complexity of managing all of it, and restoring tapes. There are still plenty of people that use tapes. Having multiple data centers, making sure that things are redundant and up and running. And then you've got the coverage and compliance concerns, right? You need to retain data for X amount of time. You need to provide that service and make sure that it's available to the customer. And it can be really, really challenging to deal with all this, right? So with Microsoft Azure, you can accelerate your business continuity strategy by reducing cost, reducing complexity, and increasing compliance, right? This is just a quick report, that cloud-based backup strategies are significantly higher than they were, and they're continuing to grow as the solutions become more available and they're less expensive, right? So when we think about what that continuity strategy looks like, right? You need the high availability for when your applications have a catastrophic failure in the same location, right? And you need to run a second instance. You need to have disaster recovery for when your site has a catastrophic failure, and you can run them in Azure or in a secondary data center. And you really need to have that backup available for when the data gets corrupted, deleted, or lost, right? So you can quickly restore it. When we think about the disaster recovery piece, right, this is what we want to focus on right now. With we've already talked about file sync, right? So that's going to help with the backups. The high availability within your applications is going to be handled by clustering the OS and clustering your databases and making sure your applications are running. And we'll talk about application clusters in a little bit here. But when you talk about disaster recovery, Azure Site Recovery is a complete disaster recovery solution, right? So you can deploy it on Windows, you can deploy it on Linux, and you can use any cloud, right? So just a couple of scenarios. Say you're running Hyper-V or VMware, you can synchronize those across to each other, right? And that's nothing new for people. People have used this for a while, right? But these are Linux or Windows VMs, and you can go from virtual to virtual. You can also go from physical or VMware to VMware, right? So Hyper-V or physical or VMware to VMware. And that's from one site to another. That's from one machine to another in the same site. You can also go from all three, right? VMware, Hyper-V, or physical up into Azure. You can also go from any cloud. You can synchronize from AWS over to Azure. So if you're running a single cloud in AWS, you can now use this for multi-cloud environment. And you can also back up your locations from one geo to another as well, right? So it really is the complete disaster recovery solution, and it's a very low cost to check it out. There are multiple ways to deploy this. You can do it with just simple having your environment prepped and ready to go, or you can have real-time replication as well. So you'd set the RTO and RPO as you desire and go through it. So definitely check that out, right? Next, we'll talk about Azure Stack, and I'm running a little short on time, so I'm going to kind of buzz through this real quick. If you haven't heard of Azure Stack, really, or if you've only kind of glossed over what it is, it's really Microsoft's availability to give you a hybrid cloud platform for development, right? They started in the development space and it's growing as we go, but it is not a virtualization replacement play, right? It's Microsoft hypervisor local to your premise or your data center that mirrors the capabilities in Azure to a certain extent. So some of the IaaS and PaaS solutions doesn't have all the capabilities. We'll go through some of those, and it's also updating constantly, right? It is integrated with IaaS and PaaS. It is not a DIY infrastructure. So you rent this box, you lease this box as you go along, and you're paying for it on a monthly basis. It's integrated as part of your Azure bill. It's not a DIY infrastructure, right? It's regularly updated for Azure consistency. The most it can fall behind is 2 revs, and it's not a static system that you deploy and forget. So you don't just, go and set it up and walk away, right? And it truly is a cross-platform hybrid cloud. It's not a Windows-only cloud. It does support Linux, and there are several different flavors of Linux it supports. And it really is the only consistent hybrid cloud, right? So for unified development and DevOps between Azure services and Azure Stack, it gives you that capability to run the workloads on-prem, do your development on-prem, deploy out to Azure as you will, or keep on-prem if you want for whatever reasons you have to have that service and you want to take advantage of those Azure offerings, right? Azure services everywhere. There's close to 50 regions now. This slide's a little old. You've got hundreds of service providers, and really you've got thousands of enterprises that are using Azure. So when you look at Stack and what it has to offer, right? It offers the Azure App Service, Azure Functions, Service Fabric, Kubernetes, Cloud Foundry, virtual machines for Linux and Windows, Docker containers, a lot of the networking that you're used to, storage, as well as the key vaults for application keys and secret. And currently, these are the vendors who are selling the platform. So you would work with one of these vendors, Dell, HPE, Lenovo, and then you order your device, you get it up and running. It becomes an extension of your Azure bill as you're currently paying for it, and it integrates nicely and has quite a bit of support that backs it, right? So it's the same support that you're used to calling in for your Azure support. How do you get started? You start to develop your applications in Azure to understand what it's like. You're going to validate to make sure that they're compliant with what Stack is required, and you're going to build that development kit. You deploy that development kit, and then you're going to order your Azure Stack and get it running. So. Next, we'll kind of run through remote management, right? So we're all fairly familiar with a lot of these. So, Task Manager and Resource Monitor, Performance Monitor, right? So we've got all of these management areas that we need to use in order to manage our Windows services, in order to run our environments, networking, updates, all that stuff. So if you haven't checked out Project Honolulu, it was announced last year by Microsoft. And what it is it's a modern management platform, right? So we just looked at 10 plus management windows as separate boxes and separate utilities that have to be brought up. And this is an aggregate tool set, right, that is meant to replace like Server Manager and MMC, right? It's used alongside things like System Center Operation Manager, but it can help you manage your on-prem environment and some features in Azure. So this is just a sample window of Project Honolulu, where you're looking at the resources of a machine. Along the left-hand side, you can see that you can look at certificates, devices, events, files, and these are all specific to this workstation. right? Let's just say we want to add a role. You want to add the Hyper-V management tools and Hyper-V module for PowerShell, right? You would do it through this interface rather than having to go through Server Manager roles and features and going through that whole loop. You can see you can do Windows updates through here. You can manage your storage through here. You can run the Hyperconverged Cluster Manager, right? So you can look at all of your environments, variables inside your clusters, right? So you know, the green would be just your alerts here. This blue area is the overall cluster performance, and the yellow is the overall resource use, right? So coming down the road here for Honolulu is integrating it with Azure Backup, right? So using the same interface to set up your systems, right? So you set your backup parameters, you select what you want to back up and when you want to back it up, and then you can select your machines, and then down on the bottom right corner there, you can see you can apply it to all of the servers that are in this list, or you can apply it to just the one, right? Just some high-level notes about Honolulu, right? The cost is that it's free. You can use it with Edge and Chrome. It'll install on Server 2016, 2019, 12R2, and Windows 10. That's the management interface. It will manage 2019, 16, 12R2, 12, and Hyper-V server. So if you're running 8 or 8R2, it's time to get started moving towards the migration, right? Azure is not required, the internet is not required, and Active Directory is not required. Use the HTTPS, LAPS, and delegation services. Configuration IS is not required. Agents are not required. SQL is not required. All that's required is the Windows Management Framework 5.1, and that's already built into 16 and 19, so you just have to install it in 12 and 12R2. It's designed to be complementary to RSAT, System Center, and OMS, and replace all of those inbox tools, right? And Microsoft really wants to hear how you feel about it, and they want you to vote and you know, give them more information. They are building SDKs that are allowing you to extend it, right? So, as I mentioned, we're going to get into containers, very, very high level. If you're in app dev and you're not using containers, you're the people who weren't using virtual machines 10 years ago, right? We saw how that went. Containers really allow you to be more portable, efficient, and reliable, right? It transforms those monoliths. So you need a server to do something. You can now use microservices to do that. And it can help you accelerate application development, right? So image to Docker is a tool, right? It's an open source PowerShell module. What you do is you connect into a VHD file for a virtual machine. It extracts the components installed and compiles a Docker file. It builds a Docker container, and then it looks at the artifacts, right, and the features installed. So for instance, this machine is looking for IIS instances, and it pulls the ASP.NET files and builds a Docker container around that app, right? So, you know, currently it's available. You can download it and just search for image to Docker. It supports numerous workloads, SQL Server instances, Apache web server. So if you haven't started playing with these, it really gives you an opportunity here to start to modernize what that application development space looks like. So now in sort of wrapping up here, you know, really what I hoped to accomplish today was that, you know, we could look at some of the features that are free or very, very cheap to, you know, get started using Azure or starting extending your platform using that hybrid model into Azure. So we talked about Azure Active Directory Connect, Azure File Sync, Honolulu Site Recovery, containers, and really the Azure SQL Server and managed instances. Managed instances have just, you know, recently become available, and you know, it really allows you to extend that SQL environment that you're currently used to right to your cloud environment. And remember, IT heroes are hybrid cloud admins. So I think we've got a few minutes for questions. So if there are specific questions, fire away.
All right, let me pull it up. So We don't have any right now, so if you guys do have
Okay.
questions, please go ahead and put them in the questions panel. We'll give you guys a couple minutes to throw those in there. So Chris, anything you want to follow up on while we're waiting on some questions to queue up?
So there is actually this next page here just kind of gives you some links so you can take a look at the Windows Insider program, right? So this gives you firsthand knowledge on things that are coming down the pipe, right? There's a link for Honolulu where you can download the software. It's a very small install. It's about 30 megs. Installs very, very quickly. And then, yeah, Server 2019, the evaluations are out there. It's still in beta.
All right. So we've got one question of someone that likes Azure, but their company uses AWS, so they want to know how they can try Azure, just on their own.
Sure. So if you go to the Azure portal, it's portal.azure.com. They have links right there that allow you to get started for free, right? So the first month is $200 worth of compute for free. It lasts 30 days, and it only works once per email. But that gives you an opportunity to start playing around with some of the services in there and see what the control panel looks like. Start working with the features. You can even look at some of the Azure Active Directory. The synchronizing in that is free. So those are some good ways to get started.
All right. Again, I'll give everyone just a couple more minutes on questions, and then if we don't have any more, we'll end the session.
So I guess while we're waiting, if anybody comes through, I can plug that we have our Azure Everyday series, right? So we're taking a few minutes each day, putting in 3 to 5 minute videos about one Azure technology. So if you go to blog.pragmaticworks.com, we've got a lot of great content out there about Power BI, about Azure, about anything in the data platform. And there's some great opportunity there to just kind of learn at either a high level or sometimes we deep dive on some of the technologies.
All right, we got one more question. Do you need to be a domain admin to evaluate, test Azure AD Connect?
Yes, you would have to have domain admin privileges in order to use the service. You'd have to have that privilege in order to synchronize with your existing AD.
And then have you heard any news about multidimensional support in Azure Analysis Services?
As far as I know, we'd have to check with the team on that, but as far as I know, there is no plan for multidimensional support. I believe the plan is to be all tabular going forward.
Okay, well, great. I think that's all the questions we have. If you guys do happen to think of any questions, you can email me, Liz. It's the email that comes with all your GoToWebinar information, and I'll be happy to pass along to Chris. You can also email Chris directly. It's ccepharlis@pragmaticworks.com. As always, you'll receive a link to the recording after this session. And thank you so much, Chris, for hosting, and thank you, everybody, for joining us, and we'll see you on the next one.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.